Hi class, welcome to chapter 3, part 2. In this section, you're going to be learning about the effects of stress. We're going to be looking at how do we respond to stress, and you'll be learning more about the negative emotions, and you'll also learn about the role that positive emotions play. You'll learn about the effects of emotional arousal on coping efforts and the fight or flight response. You'll also be learning about post-traumatic stress disorder and the symptoms and some of the causes and how often it occurs. And then you'll also be learning about how stress affects our physical health and how stress can possibly lead to some beneficial effects. A lot of this is how we think about stress. Do we view it as a threat, or do we see that it is something that is actually helping our bodies? Is it something that is really telling us about how strong we are and how capable we are as people? So our perspective can play a role in how we experience stress. You're also going to be learning about general adaptation syndrome, and you'll learn about how the body is experiencing stress during each of these stages. And you'll be learning too about the major pathways that stress travels down, or that the information about stress is traveling, so that we have an adaptive response. And then you'll be learning about coping. So let's get started. First of all, when we think about stress, our stress responses occur at three levels. We have our emotional response, we have our physiological response, and we have our behavioral response. Oftentimes, when we are under stress, we have an emotional response that is negative, and this may lead to feelings of annoyance, anger. Sometimes it can lead to rage, which we know that these emotions then can lead to even more negative outcomes, and they can create more stress because of how we're handling that stressor that we're dealing with. We might also experience apprehension. Maybe we're avoiding whatever it is that's causing us to feel stress. We might be avoiding a particular person. We might be feeling a lot of anxiety when we think about a situation. You might, for example, when you have apprehension about, let's say, doing a presentation in a class, you might avoid going to class that day. And then this, of course, can lead to more anxiety as you think about your grade. This also, the feelings of apprehension and anxiety can have an effect on how well we're able to focus and concentrate and perform. And we'll be looking at that. Sometimes when we experience stressors, we may experience dejection and sadness, especially when the stressor is an experience of loss. So it might be, as you think about the social readjustment rating scale, loss could be the loss of a significant person. Of course, that's the most traumatic, but it can also be the loss of perhaps some goal that you had, something that you really wanted to achieve, and maybe at that time you weren't able to. And so how you respond to that feeling of initial dejection or sadness then can have an effect on whether or not you are picking yourself back up and continuing to try and achieve your goals. When we think about stress and emotions, we do often think about stress causing negative emotions, but sometimes what happens is we can experience positive emotions. So think about a time when you've experienced a stressor and it's caused you, as you've tried to solve problems, tried to figure out the solution, it's caused you to have an increase in creativity. It's caused you to be more flexible. So think about when you haven't been able to achieve a particular goal, or something has gone wrong in your workplace, and some of you may be very good at handling those kinds of stressors where something is blocking whatever it is that you're trying to achieve. And so you're very flexible, you're very creative in coming up with new ways to try and reach that goal. And so stress can cause these positive emotional responses. In essence, what we're talking about is stress leading to some personal growth. Also, stress can lead to enhanced immune functioning. And one of the benefits of stress also is that it can lead to an increase in valuable support. Whenever we experience stress, we can have a release of hormones that cause us to want to bond with other people. So it's as though our body is primed and ready when we're under stress to connect with others. And this is very adaptive. This is very helpful because we know that when we connect with others, when we reach out to other people, we're better equipped, we're better able to deal with that particular stressor. So I want to point out here, as I say, enhanced immune system functioning. This is initially we have this, but if we continue to have stressors and we don't have the coping mechanisms that we need that are healthy, then our immune system functioning is going to decline. And this can make us more likely to get sick and more likely to be resistant to disease. And it can actually lead to inflammation in our body, which has a whole host of effects that we'll be exploring. And also stress can lead to what's called proactive coping. And so this means that when you think you're going to be experiencing a stressor, you might reach out to someone, you might reach out to a friend, you might do something that is healthy, that's going to be helpful to you, and in really preventing you from experiencing the negative effects of stress. When we think about the negative emotions that go with stress, these negative emotions can reduce our ability to cope with stress, but they can also enhance our ability. And it depends upon the level of arousal and the task complexity. So when we think about our level of arousal, let's talk first about what that means. When we think about arousal, this means things that are going on inside of our bodies that are affecting how we feel. And then we have arousal that can come from outside of our bodies. Things that can be going on inside of our bodies can be rumination, so a lot of repeated thinking about something, a lot of worrying. That's a source of arousal. Another source of arousal could be where you are feeling your heart rate increase, you're feeling your increase in breathing rate, anything that's going on inside of your body. That is an internal source of arousal. So anything that you're noticing, so it could involve your thinking, it could involve your physiology. Those are both sources of arousal. And as you have more of those happening, then it becomes harder for you to deal with the task that's complex. So if let's say you have a math test, and maybe it's a math test that is a really difficult test. Maybe it's something you don't feel very comfortable with. Maybe you haven't been able to study, or you just might not have been able to grasp the concept. If you have a lot of internal physiological arousal, this can have a negative effect on task performance. So if you're worrying a lot, or if you're noticing your increase in heart rate, you're noticing your breathing rate, those are sources of arousal that can negatively affect performance. What are some external sources? Well, they could be anything going on around you. It could be lots of noise. It could be lots of people around you. It could be even little bits of noise can be a source of arousal. So let's go back to taking a test, and let's imagine you're in your math class taking a test and it's quiet. No one's walking around, but the person next to you is tapping their pencil over and over again. Or maybe you hear the clicking of someone's or the ticking of someone's watch. Those can be sources of arousal that are coming from outside of you. When you're really worried and you have that going on, now you're adding to that level of arousal, and your arousal level is very high for that task that you're trying to do well at. Because the task is complex, you don't want to be over aroused. So we have to think about how can we reduce that arousal. So for some of us, it could involve deep breathing. Let's say you're taking a test and you're noticing those things that are going on inside of your body. You might take a moment to just take some deep breaths. It might be that you have some internal statements that you say to yourself to remind yourself of staying focused and being relaxed. It might be having some ways of challenging irrational thoughts that you have so that you can reduce that level of worry that you have. So anything you can do when you're doing something that's very complex to reduce that internal arousal, or if you're able to control the external arousal, this can be very helpful. For some of you, you might find that external arousal is just way overstimulating for you. And so it may be that you need to have a separate testing environment, and you may qualify. It may be that, let's say you have ADHD, and we typically think of ADHD as something that children and adolescents and teens deal with, but there are many adults who have ADHD. And when you do, this can lead you to feel very easily overstimulated. And so when you're overstimulated from the person tapping their pencil or someone who is, walking across the room, then your performance isn't going to be nearly what it would be on that complex task. And this is where getting a diagnosis from someone like your general practitioner or a psychiatrist, and then getting that documentation to the accessibility office where you can have those accommodations can be very helpful. Because what we're doing when we do things like provide accommodations is we're just leveling the playing field so that those individuals who are, let's say, overstimulated in this example are able to feel that same level of calm and focus as anyone else who isn't as easily overstimulated or distracted. So with that being said, what we can do if we don't, let's say, have a diagnosis of ADHD, let's think about what can we do to reduce that arousal. Well, it could be that if you are very easily over aroused, you might decide that you want to make sure that the class that you're in is one that is small. So I know that at different colleges, there are different size classrooms and different amounts of students. I can tell you at Northeast State, we have pretty small classes compared to other major colleges, or at least the state schools. And so for some students, they might find it very helpful to be in a class where the class is smaller, because having a lot of people around can actually be a source of stimulation. What else can you do? Sometimes people will ask if they can wear earplugs. So wearing earplugs that, and of course not the ones that provide any sound, but actually just the earplugs that you can put in your ear to block out sound. You could ask your instructor if that would be okay for you to do that. And some may be okay, may be okay with that if you show that to them so that they know that there's, it's not like it's you're not being provided with any information. You're not, these are not actual headphones that provide actual sound. So that could be a way. And then I think too, some things we could do before testing could be things like meditation. It could also involve mindfulness, which we'll be looking at later this semester. And mindfulness is being very present in the moment. It is not thinking about tomorrow, not thinking about yesterday, but thinking about right now. And by doing that, we can be very, and I will share with you how we can do that, some of the strategies later on in this course. There's some really helpful strategies. Mindfulness is a very, it's a very important and helpful approach to help each of us to be mentally healthier. So you could do, like I said, you could do yoga, you could also do things like meditation. I think too, when we think about physiological arousal, if you're not used to drinking caffeine and you go in to take a test, it's not going to be a good idea for you to drink much caffeine before the test, because that's a source of arousal. Because what's happening is, of course, that caffeine is increasing your heart rate. It's making you feel a little bit jittery. And this is increasing that arousal. So anything you can do to keep that calm state is going to be very helpful. Now, if you have to do something that's very boring, or that is even, let's say that it's something that you're already really good at, maybe it's not so boring, but it's something that it's not very complex or difficult for you, then you're going to actually do better with a higher level of arousal. So if you don't have much going on around you, if you don't have much going on in your mind, and you're doing something that you're really good at, your performance may not be as good as it would be if you were doing things if you're performing a relatively easy task when there is more stimulation. I would equate this to playing sports. So for people who are really good at a particular sport, they might find that when there are spectators that they tend to do even better. But when no one's watching, they don't tend to do as well. And this is because they're already really good at that particular sport, and having people present helps to increase that level of arousal. So we all need to find that optimal level of arousal that's going to work best for us. So I know for myself, I'll give you an example. My mom has a pool table in her basement, and whenever I go to visit her, I play pool. I don't get to play pool very much at all. It's been years since I've really gotten to play much except at her house. When I'm by myself, I feel like I do really well. But as soon as anyone comes downstairs to the basement to play with me, I don't do nearly as well. So if we think about this inverted U hypothesis, the reason that this is happening is because, is that task something that's easy for me or not so easy? It's not so easy because I don't play it much. So I need very minimal stimulation around in order to do well. But for a task that is, for a task, if that task was done by someone who's really good at it, they're going to do even better when there are other people around. So the reason I don't do so well when other people come around is because that's a source of stimulation. So you can look here and you can see in your textbook, this is a nice diagram for you to note where you can see that each of us function best under a certain level of arousal depending upon the complexity of the task. The more complex the task, the less arousal that we need. And remember, that arousal can come from inside of us or outside of us. When we are overstimulated, this can lead to a decrease in performance when the task is complex. So we want to be careful about that. So think about how you can apply that to your schoolwork, or if you play sports, think about how you could apply it to that. When we respond to stress, we have this physiological arousal. All of you know this, and this physiological arousal or response that we each experience is called the fight or flight response. And this is something that doesn't only happen to us as humans, this is something that animals experience as well. So when each of us feel threatened or that we're in some potential danger, then we have this fight or flight response. And this is happening because of what's called our autonomic nervous system. So our autonomic nervous system is comprised of two specific divisions that are called the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. So the sympathetic nervous system, what it does is when we're experiencing a threat, it helps us to respond to that threat by causing some automatic or involuntary responses. Those can be things like an increase in our heart rate, an increase in our breathing rate, a decrease in digestion. Think about why we would need to have a decrease in digestion. Do we need to focus our energy, our resources? Does blood need to be going to our digestive tract, or does it need to be going to our muscles so that we can fight or flee? Well, we don't need to be dealing with what we recently ate. We need to use that energy. We need our blood to go to our muscles so that we can fight or flee. Now, I want you to think for a moment about this. Remember, we talked about chronic stressors and acute stressors. So acute stressors lead to this fight or flight response. But let's imagine those acute stressors turn into chronic stressors. And now we have this sympathetic nervous system activation that's continuous. And so think about, just as an example, your digestion. So if your digestion is slowed down because you have this sympathetic nervous system arousal from chronic stressors, what kinds of symptoms are you going to have? Might you feel nauseated? Might you feel like you've maybe lost your appetite? Might you find that you have diarrhea, constipation? So you may have a whole host of physical symptoms that are related to digestion because of stressors. Believe it or not, many years ago, actually not that many years ago, probably 25 years ago, this idea of our body being connected to our mind was thought of as something that was new and sort of almost new age, which is very interesting because we know, based on the science today, that our bodies and our minds, our psychology and our physiology are very intimately connected. So if you were to go to the doctor, let's say 25, 30 years ago, and you were having some issues with feeling nauseated often, or maybe you were having a lot of stomach aches or issues, anything related to digestion, the doctors probably was not going to be that focused on what was going on in your psychological well-being. They're going to be looking at what's happening physiologically. But now, as probably most of you know, when you go to the doctor, they're asking you about your life and about what's going on, and have you been under stress? Have you been under pressure? Have you been worrying? Have you been having some symptoms of depression, especially as you're coming in with some physical symptoms, because those are interrelated. And when we think about the sympathetic nervous system, we can think about how those changes that we experience as a result of that can cause then changes in our overall health and well-being. And they can have some long-term, very significant consequences. So it's very helpful that we have this response. Clearly, we need this response. But to have it chronically activated or frequently activated, because think about your ancestors, they needed that fight or flight response, right? We need the fight or flight response. Do we have, though, as many threats that require us to have those changes in our body, the increase in heart rate, decrease in digestion, increase in blood pressure, increase in stress hormones, dilation of pupils? Do we really have that many stressors that require that to happen? No, we don't. Most of us do not have those types of stressors often. Most of us aren't having to decide, do I have to fight or do I have to flee? Unfortunately, there are people who often do. Maybe they are in abusive environments, or maybe they live in a dangerous area and they feel frequently threatened. But for the most part, as humans, overall, we don't have the same degree of threat that requires that type of response like our ancestors did. But because it takes so long for genetic changes to take place within any species, I mean, it takes lots and lots of generations, multiple generations. This is not, we can see then that there is a misalignment between what's happening in our own culture, our own world, and our biology. So there is this misalignment that's there. So we have to make sure that we're aware of that and that we find ways to calm down so that we are and regulate that stress, and to have good tactics or strategies for coping with stress. And we'll be looking at those because we know that we have a lot of things going on in our lives that can cause physiological arousal that don't necessarily require that arousal, but because that's what our body does, it happens. So we have to find ways to mitigate that so that we don't experience an increased likelihood of illness and disease. So again, the sympathetic nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system, you can look in your textbook at figure 310. These are two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. I think of autonomic as automatic. So we have our autonomic nervous system. And I could just say it like this, like I would, let's see here. I'm going to think of it like here we have our central nervous system, okay? And then here we have our peripheral nervous system. And probably many of you remember this. Sorry, my writing is not great. I'm using my cursor on my mouse. So here we have our central. And so what's in our central? Think to yourself. It would be our brain. I'm going to just put B for brain and S for spinal cord. Our peripheral nervous system is comprised of two major divisions. We have our autonomic. Okay, I'll just put auto for autonomic. And then we have what's called our somatic. And I'm not going to ask you this on a test, but I like to give you context. So we're not just talking about some random division out there that you don't really see its connection to anything else. So the somatic nervous system is responsible for sensing and responding. But the autonomic nervous system is involuntary, fortunately. Imagine if you had to think about these things happening in your body when you were being threatened. You probably wouldn't be very likely to survive. You're in the woods and you suddenly see a bear, and you know, your body is going to need to know, your body's going to need to respond in a way that's going to allow you to survive. If you had to think through each of these things, you wouldn't be likely to survive. So autonomic nervous system, we have two major divisions. We have our sympathetic, we'll put SYMP for sympathetic, and then we have our parasympathetic. Okay, and so I think of autonomic as automatic. It doesn't require any voluntary response. And then within that autonomic, we have our sympathetic. It's sympathizing with us. It's saying, I feel bad for you. I want to help you in this particular situation, this emergency or this threat. And then we have our parasympathetic, which is so important because it brings us back to homeostasis, and that's a balanced state of functioning. You might have heard of it stated as rest and digest. So sympathetic is sympathizing with you. Parasympathetic is responding by bringing you back to that balanced state of functioning. So it has a calming effect on the body. And here are the things that are happening throughout our body when we experience sympathetic nervous system arousal. So we have our pupils dilated, we may have goosebumps, and we have reduction in salivation, so dry mouth, increase in perspiration. We're going to have our airways dilated, increase in heart rate. The blood is supplied to the muscles, so there's a decrease in digestion. So we're also seeing an increased activity in the adrenal glands. And so the adrenal glands are located just above the kidneys, and they're responsible for secreting stress hormones. And so we'll be looking at stress hormones and their effect on the body. And then we have our parasympathetic, and as you can see, it's bringing us right back to that normal, balanced state of functioning. So one other thing that I want to point out is that when you experience sympathetic nervous system arousal, when you are very stressed, not only do you see these things happening, something else is happening that probably many of you have noticed, and that is your ability to think clearly, make good decisions, control your feelings, and perhaps your impulses is not nearly as good. It seems to be inhibited, and we seem to be acting in a fairly primitive way, which makes sense because this is a survival fight or flight response. But let's think about what the implications are for this. So if you're feeling threatened, you're feeling upset, you're feeling like you're in this fight or flight mode, you're not going to be as good at controlling your emotions. You're not going to be as good at controlling what you say. So you might be more inclined to say things you regret. You might be more inclined to make bad decisions. So it seems that you might ask, well, why would we be more inclined to do that if this is supposed to be adaptive? Well, it seems that our primitive response of being in primitive, meaning that we not only are we having these things happening in our body, we're also relying less on the prefrontal cortex or frontal lobe. That's the part of the brain that's responsible for those higher level processes. And we're relying on the more primitive parts of our brain. So we're relying on, say, the limbic system, which plays a very important role in emotion and memory. So it makes sense that we would have this response because we need to make sure that in the future we remember those things that were a threat, that we remember everything about that environment that was causing that threat, so that anytime we encounter it in the future or anything that resembles it, our body is ready so that we can fight or flee, and this increases our chances of survival. But if we had to sit and contemplate about what we needed to do, should I do this, should I do that, that's going to slow you down. Now, keep in mind, for our ancestors, that was great, but for us today, it actually can be harmful. So you're driving down the road and you feel threatened by a driver that cuts you off. And so maybe you respond in a way that you would have never responded otherwise. You would have never acted that way to any other person, but you felt threatened. You had that sympathetic nervous system arousal. The prefrontal cortex is not operating in the way it typically does, and so you're not controlling yourself. You're saying things, you're doing things you would have never done before because of that sympathetic nervous system arousal. This is not helpful for us as people when we're driving. But our ancestors were not driving. Our ancestors didn't have the same modern day threats that we do. And so again, we have to figure out ways that we can mitigate this response so that we are more reliant on our prefrontal cortex, that we're able to make better choices, and we don't have the significant detrimental effects on our body from having that very frequent sympathetic nervous system activation. There's an approach to thinking about stress that's called general adaptation syndrome, and this was developed by a man named Hans Selye, and he studied how stress affects the body, and he identified 3 stages or phases that we go through when we experience the encountering of a stressor. So Hans Selye came up with this general adaptation syndrome after he was observing lab rats at a university that he worked at, and he noticed that when these rats were exposed to stressful events, that they went through a series of physiological changes. You might ask yourself, what kinds of events would be stressful for rats? Well, the same kinds of basic events that would be stressful for any animal or even human, the general underlying principles. So unpredictability, loud noises, those sorts of things. So you could create a situation where a rat is experiencing stressors, and then you could observe through analyzing their physiological changes. You could observe then what's happening in their bodies. And there's a significant parallel between what rats experience and what humans experience. And so when Hans Selye was noticing this, this was just in his initial studies when he was observing the effects of stress on these animals. He noticed that not only was it just something that a few rats were experiencing, but that it was a very typical response, that there was a common series of stages that these rats were going through when they experienced stress. And so he came up with these stages that he called the alarm stage, resistance, and exhaustion stages. So in the alarm stage, this is when, and this is what happens to us, this is when we have the initial symptoms that our body experiences when we're under stress. And so this is the fight or flight response, that physiological response. And again, this is the natural reaction that's preparing us to fight or to flee. So we have, again, that increase in heart rate. We have the adrenal glands secreting stress hormones like cortisol. We also can have an increase in adrenaline. So this response is happening in the alarm stage. And then we have what's called the resistance stage. So after that initial shock of that stressful event, whatever that stressful event is, and after we've had that fight or flight response, the body begins to repair itself. So what it does is it begins to lower the amount of stress hormones like cortisol. Our heart rate and our blood pressure begin to go back to normal. So what's happening is we're going back to our state of homeostasis. But even though our body is entering this phase of, basically we could think of it as recovery, it stays on high alert for a while. So, you overcome stress and the situation's no longer an issue, your body is still continuing to repair itself until your hormone levels, your heart rate, and your blood pressure reach the state that they were in before you were in that stress state. And sometimes stressful situations like we've talked about can continue for extended periods of time. So we may have a chronic stressor. So maybe you haven't been able to resolve the stressor, or you can't resolve the stressor. And so your body stays on high alert. And then what it does is it eventually adapts and it learns how to live with a higher stress level. And so when this is happening, the body is going through changes that you're not aware of in an attempt then to cope with that stress. So what your body's doing is it's continuing to secrete the stress hormones, and your blood pressure is remaining somewhat elevated. And you're thinking in your mind you're managing the stress well. So in your mind it feels like everything's okay, but your body's physical response is telling something very different. And if this resistance stage goes on for too long, and where you're not having any pauses to offset the effects of stress, this then can lead to the state of exhaustion. And so this stage of exhaustion is the result of prolonged or chronic stress. So this could be stressors that you're experiencing for a long time that are they can drain your physical energy. They might drain your mental resources, your emotional resources, to the point where you don't have the strength to fight the stress anymore. And some of you may have experienced this before, where you may even feel like giving up. You feel hopeless. And so this stage of exhaustion has some physical consequences and psychological consequences. So you may experience feelings of depression and anxiety. You may also have feelings of burnout. You might feel exhausted, so very tired, and you have a decreased stress tolerance. So it's more difficult for you to deal with new stressors. And the physical effects of this stage weaken your immune system, and they can put you at risk for stress-related illnesses. So here's a chart or diagram that shows you general adaptation syndrome, and you can see that alarm stage, and you can see again in that alarm stage, this is when we have that fight or flight response, and we have that, in other words, that physiological response to stress, and then we have the resistance stage, and then we're in the resistance stage, and this is when our body is beginning to repair itself, and we are experiencing that parasympathetic nervous system response where we're moving back to homeostasis. But you can see here that we then start to move down in our level of resistance to stress. And if the stress goes on for too long, or we start adding additional stressors, then we move into that state of exhaustion. There are two brain-body pathways that control our physiological responses to stress. There's the catecholamine pathway, and there is the corticosteroid pathway. And the activation of these pathways not only has an effect on our body's ability to deal with stress, but can, especially when they are frequently activated or chronically activated, have an effect on us both physiologically and psychologically. So let's first take a look at the catecholamine pathway. So here we have the hypothalamus, which is in the limbic system, the part of the brain that's actually that primitive part of the brain. And when I say primitive, what I mean is that it's inside of the brain. It's not part of that outer wrinkled area that we think of as the cerebral cortex. So it's inside of the brain. When we think about primitive, this means if we think about humans over time and history, these were developed early in human history, whereas the cerebral cortex was later to develop. And we also see the hypothalamus and other parts of the limbic system in other animals. So it really is that part of the brain that is primitive, and it's activating the sympathetic nervous system. Remember, the sympathetic nervous system is responsible for the fight or flight response. And then we also have the adrenal glands, and those are they're part of the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a series of glands throughout our body that release hormones. And so the adrenal glands are located just above our kidneys, and they release catecholamines that mobilize our body for action. So catecholamines, what are they? They're responsible for our fight or flight response. Examples of these include dopamine, and many of you have heard of that before. You've heard of dopamine, that neurotransmitter, adrenaline, and noradrenaline. And if you have too high or too low of these catecholamines, you can actually have some serious medical issues that are related to these. So we all have, typical people, the average person has a level that is helping them to just function and live on an everyday basis, and is a healthy level. So we're talking about the typical person as we look at these catecholamines. And so catecholamines are, what they're doing is they are, for example, dopamine. Let's first look at dopamine. So this is a neurotransmitter, again, that signals throughout the nervous system. And many of you know how important dopamine is for reward. So dopamine serves a very important role in reward, in memory, in emotions, and in movement. Okay, so this makes sense that we would need that neurotransmitter being released, because we need to be potentially mobilized for action. We need to, when we think about action and motivation, we know how important emotion is when we think about being motivated. We also need to be able to remember, but we also need to be able to form new memories so that the next time we encounter something similar, we are very acutely aware of any potential signs that that particular threat is present. So we learn from it. And then there needs to be some reward from this. So that's going to be motivating us to engage in those behaviors that help us to fight or to flee. So when we think about adrenaline, also known as, we can think of this also as epinephrine, and this is the neurotransmitter that's responsible for our fight or flight response. And so when you're experiencing that, just as I talked about a few moments ago, your body releases, when you have that fight or flight response, your body releases adrenaline, and this then allows increased blood flow to muscles, to our heart, and to our lungs. And then we have what's called noradrenaline, and this helps our body to respond to stress also, and it increases our heart rate and increases our blood pressure. So what you're seeing here is this catecholamine pathway that is very significantly important for our fight or flight response, and that's because of dopamine, adrenaline, and noradrenaline. So we have the corticosteroid pathway, and this pathway is where we have the hypothalamus, again, part of the limbic system, signaling the pituitary gland. Now, the pituitary gland, as you may know from other courses like Intro to Psych, that is the master gland. And it's really, the hypothalamus is actually controlling, it's regulating the pituitary gland. It's signaling to the pituitary gland when to release certain hormones. So the hypothalamus is very important in the endocrine system, even though it is something that we don't often think of when we think about the endocrine glands. So the pituitary gland is signaled then to secrete what is called ACTH. Now, I'm not going to ask you to spell this out, but I just want you to at least have some familiarity with this. And ACTH is adrenocorticotropic hormone, and you'll see that in your textbook. And so you probably wonder, what is this? Well, this is a hormone that's, again, it's made by the pituitary gland. And this hormone controls the production of cortisol. So cortisol is it's a stress hormone, and it plays an important role in our ability to respond to stress, to fight infection, regulate our blood sugar, maintain blood pressure, and regulate our metabolism. So you should have some bells going off in your mind as you think about this, and you think about someone who's under chronic stress and they do not have a return or a very frequent return to homeostasis, to that balanced state, and they have a frequent elevation or chronic elevation of cortisol. So if it plays a role in regulating blood sugar, maintaining blood pressure, regulating metabolism, and these cortisol levels get too high, okay, because they're too often activated, then we may find that the person has an imbalance in their blood sugar, that their blood pressure has been negatively affected, their ability to fight infection has been decreased. Okay, so too much or too little of cortisol can cause some serious health problems. So we don't want to have this activated at high levels often, and certainly not chronically, because then we can have some negative health consequences. And so we have, when we think about then the ACTH, here we can see here, that's helping us to deal with that stress response, okay? And then in addition, we have the adrenal cortex, okay? And this is actually located above the adrenal glands, and that releases corticosteroids. And the corticosteroids, they increase energy. So we all heard that stress can have an effect on our health, but here now you're learning to some degree, at some level, you're learning exactly what's going on within our bodies when we experience stress. And you're learning what the natural response to stress is, and how, if that natural response is chronically activated, or if it is activated and then it doesn't have the chance to go back to normal very often, then we can have a disruption in lots of body systems. So when you see here in this image on figure 313, you can see that there are signals, like we just talked about, that are traveling along two pathways. And the pathway through the autonomic nervous system, and this is shown in blue, controls the release of the catecholamine hormones that mobilize the body for action. And then the pathway through the pituitary gland and the endocrine system, this is on the left, controls the release of the corticosteroid hormones that increase energy and ward off tissue inflammation. So these are natural responses, but when we are experiencing chronic stress or when we're experiencing if we're experiencing chronic stress or frequent acute stress where we don't have that chance for our body to get back to that balanced state, then lots of different body systems can be affected. We'll be looking at those, how our body is affected here shortly. So first of all, what are we doing then when we experience stress? What are some ways that we respond to stress behaviorally? So we looked at our physiological responses. Here are some of our behavioral responses. Some of you are really good at responding to stress. Maybe you have some very healthy approaches. You actively try to solve the problem. You might ask for help. So maybe you are connecting with friends. You're trying to seek resources. You're trying to come up with solutions. Unhealthy solutions can include ignoring the problem. Now, I want to point out here that ignoring the problem is normally it's not a healthy coping mechanism. But sometimes it can be if the stressor is completely uncontrollable. So if you can't do something about it at that moment or within a short time, ignoring it sometimes, not always, can be helpful. So let's say that you live in an apartment building where there's a lot of noise and your neighbors are very annoying because they're very loud. And so if you're regularly thinking about this, and you're wanting to do something about it, and you do something, you try to talk to someone about it, maybe you talk to management and it's not doing anything, focusing on that problem, fixating on it is not going to be healthy. You might want to instead think about how can I move out of this apartment building. So that's a much healthier approach than, say, just thinking about the problem itself. You might also find that people will indulge in alcohol or other drugs, or they may eat a lot. So these are some unhealthy responses. So we've looked at what's happening with stress within our bodies. We've taken a look at how we respond physiologically, and we've also taken a look at a little bit of how we look at or how we experience stress behaviorally. So now let's take a look then at the effects of stress. So why do we choke under pressure, for example? Why is it that when we're under stress, we may lose our ability to remember what we want to say? And probably as you're thinking about some of what you've learned about the brain and those higher level functions not being as active when you're under stress, you're beginning to understand physiologically what's going on. You're also going to be looking at how does stress affect cognitive functioning? How does it affect our thinking and impulse control and our decision making? And you're also going to be learning about burnout, the symptoms of that. And remember, burnout is something that happens in that exhaustion stage that Celia said that we go through. And then you're going to be looking at the effects of stress on psychological health. And we're also going to be looking at post-traumatic stress disorder, and we'll be looking at how stress affects us physically. And then we'll also look at how stress can have some beneficial effects. So we've talked about the effects of stress on performance when we have, especially if we have a complex task. So you're going in to take a math test, the test is really difficult, you have a lot going on around you, maybe there's a lot of noise, you've got a lot of worry. And so we know that when there's physiological arousal or when there is psychological arousal, when there's things going on around you, that this can have a negative effect on performance. Well, stress can potentially be a source of arousal. And in addition, stress can, of course, as you learned, have an effect on our brain. So what it's doing is it's causing an activation of the more primitive parts of our brain and less activity in the parts of our brain that are responsible for higher level processing. So we have those two things going on. So stress can cause us to freeze up, where we can't remember what we're going to say, or where we we might have trouble, performing in a way that we normally would be able to otherwise. Maybe we're not able to be at our best. And this is because of what's happening in our brains. And it's also because stress can be that additional source of arousal, going back to that inverted U hypothesis. And then what else can happen when we're experiencing stress is that this can actually lead to an increased level of self-consciousness. So you're beginning to think that you're not doing as well. You're focusing on how you're talking, on how you're coming across, in let's say a speech that you're giving in your class, and then this can disrupt your ability to pay attention and focus and this is going to disrupt your ability to do well at that particular task. So you're more self-conscious when you are experiencing stress. And then we know that when people are stressed, they have the increased tendency to jump to conclusions. We know that. That's something you knew probably before you came into this class. But the reason is because our brain is relying more on those where we physiologically are relying more on our primitive structures, and the parts of our brain that are responsible for higher level processing aren't as active. Those that would help us to make more rational choices and decisions are not as active, and so we're more likely to jump to conclusions, and we have a decreased ability to really thoughtfully and carefully review our options. And then also when we're under stress, probably most of you have noticed this is probably something I've noticed myself a lot in myself, is that when I'm under stress, I tend to get forgetful. I tend to forget where I put my phone or where I put my keys, or maybe why I came into a room. So if I have a lot on my mind or I'm really stressed, maybe let's say my kids are staying up later than they normally do, and maybe they're really tired and irritable, and this stresses me out when they get really upset or grumpy. And so then it causes me to be very forgetful. I'm very affected by that. So for each of you, you all probably have those things in your life that serve as big stressors for you and then can cause you to become forgetful. So if we can reduce the effect or mitigate the effects of those stressors, then we can increase our memory function. We can be better at reviewing our options. And even just being aware of these things can be very helpful as well. You also learned about this exhaustion stage that Hans Selye said that we go into. And that exhaustion stage, that's when we experience burnout. Now, your textbook refers to burnout in terms of its relationship to work stress, but we can think of burnout as being even broader than that. So we can have burnout at work, but you can have burnout in any area of your life. I think that when we think about taking care of children, for example, for any of you who are parents, I think we often think of that as separate from work, but actually that is a form of work. It's a form of, because there's a lot of responsibility, there's accountability. We're not paid for it, but there's a tremendous amount of value associated with it. So certainly many of you as parents may have at some point felt that burnout before, where you've thought, oh, I just don't know if I can be as good as I want to be as a parent. Maybe, your kids are really upset about something and you've tried to help them, and maybe there's multiple things you're trying to manage in your family. Maybe, whatever those things are, it can eventually feel overwhelming. So I think we need to think of burnout as beyond work. And Hans Selye did not just think of burnout as related to work. We typically think of it as that, but it can be really in any area of your life. Think of yourself as a student. You might, especially at the end of the semester, I know for myself, as a student, every semester, at the end of the semester, I would get sick at the end of every single semester. Especially at the end of the fall semester, that's when I would get the most sick. I would end up with the flu, or I would end up with some upper respiratory thing. So it seemed like I just could not get away from having that. And it was because of, as all of you know, towards the end of the semester, you've got lots of things due, you've got final exams, you've got a lot of pressures. And of course, in the winter time, you have lots of viruses that are circulating, and you're not going to be as resistant to those things as you would be otherwise when you've been under a lot of stress. So if you look in your textbook, there's a nice figure that shows you some of the things that might lead to burnout. And we could think about also how we might parallel this with school as well, or other important elements of our life. But let's think about work. You have too many responsibilities at work. Maybe you don't have the support that you need. You may not have the autonomy. Maybe you don't know what your next schedule is going to be. You have a supervisor who doesn't give you much independence or opportunities to make your own choices. Maybe you don't feel like you're being recognized for your hard work or appreciated. Not that you necessarily are seeking a reward or recognition per se, like in a formal way, but where maybe you work really hard as, let's say, maybe you are an LPN, or you work in maybe you work at a school, or you work in a restaurant, and maybe you feel like you're spending extra time at work, or maybe you're doing some extra projects, and you're not getting that recognition for what you're giving to your workplace. You're not, no one's saying thank you or we appreciate you. So, those are important. And I think that social support is also very important if you're feeling like you're not connecting with people in your workplace. Or when we think about work overload, maybe because you do really well, you keep getting extra responsibilities. All of this can lead to feelings of exhaustion, being cynical, and lowered self-efficacy. And if you'll remember from our last module, self-efficacy is your sense of competence. So how good you feel you are at something. So if you are having too many responsibilities at work, then you may not feel like you can do as well. Or maybe if someone's not giving you the choices to make at work, maybe you don't have that sense of autonomy. Maybe you may conclude that your supervisor doesn't think you're able to make those choices, and so forth. And so here are some of the consequences. We can see some increases in physical illness, increased absenteeism, decreased commitment to the job, reduced productivity. So when we think about big companies, they will often have psychologists that they hire to consult with them to provide or help to develop workplace environments that reduce those antecedents to burnout, so that there are some very positive consequences. They of course don't want people sick and absent. They don't want increased turnover. We know that that can be expensive, and when you're not as committed, you're not as likely to do well, and you're also more likely to leave. And when you're not as productive, you're not as likely to be doing well and making the company money. So there's a field within psychology called industrial organizational psychology, and there are many different things that IO psychologists, that's the abbreviation, focus on, but these would be just a few of those areas. But there are many interesting areas. So if you're interested in business and you're interested in psychology, this can be a nice field to think about going into. And it's actually one of the highest paid fields within psychology as well. Another effect of stress is post-traumatic stress disorder. And this happens as a result of having experienced some sort of major traumatic event. We often think of it as being associated with military personnel who go to war, but it can be anyone who experiences trauma. So it could be someone who witnesses a crime, who's the victim of a crime. It could be someone who witnesses an assault, who experiences some type of assault. It could be something that you experienced in your childhood that's traumatic. So any traumatic event can lead to PTSD. And so people with PTSD have a heightened sense of danger. So let's say another example of what might contribute to PTSD is an accident. So maybe if you were in a car accident, and now when you get into a car accident, you have that heightened sense of danger. Or perhaps you were in a significant storm, like maybe you were in a tornado or an earthquake, and now you feel that sense of danger if you live in that area where it might happen again. And so this then is that natural fight or flight response that's altered, and it's causing the person to feel very stressed, to feel fearful, even when they're safe. So any sort of event or place that is even slightly associated with that particular trauma can trigger these feelings. And it doesn't even have to be that the person is in that situation. It could be just having an emotion that is somewhat tied to that situation that could lead to those feelings of fear and apprehension. And so PTSD can happen to anyone. And what's happening is that when a person has this, they have had some changes in their brain that have happened after exposure to these threatening events. And some of the symptoms can be, overall, the person is going to have some problems or difficulty with everyday functioning, because this person may have feelings of apprehension or anxiety that are triggered or developed because of certain sounds or words or situations that might remind them of the trauma. And so there are actually four major groups of symptoms of PTSD. First is intrusion, and this is where a person is having flashbacks. That's, I think, what we often think about when we think about PTSD. They're having flashbacks where they feel like they're reliving the event over and over. They might have some vivid, unpleasant memories, and so these are, again, intrusive, and they might have frequent nightmares, or they might have mental or physical distress whenever they think about the event. And then there's avoidance. That's another category. And so the person might avoid people, places, or situations that are reminding them of that traumatic event. And then we have the arousal and reactivity group of symptoms. So the person may have difficulty concentrating, they might be easily startled, or maybe they have an exaggerated response when they're startled. Maybe they feel like they're on the edge, they're constantly feeling on edge, they're irritable, they might get angry easily. And then the fourth group of symptoms is thinking and mood, or cognition and mood. So the person may have some negative thoughts about themselves. They might have some feelings of guilt, worry, or blame that are distorted, and they might have trouble remembering important parts of the event, and they might have they might not like or enjoy the things that they once enjoyed. So PTSD is typically something that we would think about when we think about an event that happens in adulthood, or some significant event that is singular in number. So maybe one event where someone witnesses or is a victim of a particular assault. Or someone who experiences an isolated act of violence. But sometimes when the underlying trauma is repeated or it's ongoing, you'll actually find that some mental health professionals may see that there's, or feel that there's, a distinction between the effects of that singular event and the repeated events. Now, I do want to say that the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, it does not recognize a separate disorder from PTSD. But the ICD, which is the International Classification of Disorders, and this includes all health conditions, not just mental health conditions, it does recognize what's called CPTSD, or chronic post-traumatic stress disorder. So chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, this is where someone is having the same types of symptoms, but there also are some differences, because the trauma that the person has experienced for something that's been more chronic can be more complex, and oftentimes it does happen more early in life. So it might be something someone experienced when they were a child, and so the effects of this may be different if it's chronic than if it were a singular event. And it's certainly not to suggest that it has more significant or less significant symptoms. It would depend upon the individual's experience, but that's just something for you to keep in mind. So how often does this happen? Let's just look at PTSD. Well, any year, it's estimated that 8 million adults in the US experience this, and that in the US, we have a 7 to 8% lifetime prevalence. And what that means is that 7 to 8% of us are likely to experience PTSD in our lives. There are certain people who are more vulnerable to experiencing PTSD. Girls, women, and ethnic minorities are more likely to experience PTSD than boys, men, and Caucasians. It does not mean that they are more vulnerable to the effects of any type of awful event that might occur, but that they may be more likely to experience those events than men. Because of because of being women, we know that they are more likely to experience, for example, sexual assault. Of course, we know that boys and men can experience that. They certainly do, but the frequency is higher in girls and women. And then ethnic minorities are more likely to be victims of certain types of crimes than those who are not minorities, which then might predispose them to be at risk for PTSD. How is this treated? Psychotherapy, which could involve cognitive behavioral therapy, which focuses on changing negative thinking patterns that are linked to the event. There are different therapeutic approaches that we'll look at in one of the later modules in this course. And then medications can be helpful depending upon the individual's symptoms. There are many different consequences of chronic stress. And when we think about academic performance, this is probably one that many of you think about because you are currently in school. Maybe you are just out of, for some of you, you may be, maybe you were in high school just a few years ago, and you know what the effects of stress have been on you academically if you experienced it in your home or in other significant areas of your life. Also, we know that sleep can be affected, and sleep, of course, when that's affected, we can see a disruption in our circadian rhythms, and we can see lower levels of melatonin, and this can increase our risk of developing depression because of melatonin's relationship to serotonin. We also know it can lead to sexual difficulties, which can have its own psychological consequences, and that people may resort to using different substances, like using alcohol or drugs to deal with the stressors that they're experiencing. When we think about the opioid epidemic, there are multiple factors that are contributing to that, but certainly we know that poverty and the stressors associated with poverty can put one at risk for developing an addiction or for becoming addicted to opioids. Some of the physical effects of stress that manifest in illnesses are what are called psychosomatic diseases, include high blood pressure, peptic ulcers, and I want to point out that ulcers are not caused by stress. They are exacerbated, or you may already have what's called H. pylori bacteria. That's actually what is causing ulcers. And then when you have stress and your digestion is impacted, you're more likely to experience the development of ulcers. So they're not just coming from stress. And you are more prone to have asthma, eczema and hives, and migraines and tension headaches. When we think about stress, we often do tend to focus on the negative effects of stress. That is a focus to a degree in this chapter, in this module as well. But I want to point out that there can be many positive effects of stress. Think about when you've gotten through a stressor, when you've experienced some sort of stress in your life, and then afterwards you've realized that you are more capable of certain things than you realized, that you were stronger than you thought that you were, that you had better skills in a certain area than you thought that you had, or maybe you realized something new about yourself. All of this is part of what we could call post-traumatic growth. And so stress can promote positive psychological change. Also, stress can help to satisfy a need that we have for stimulation. We all have that need. Think about that inverted U hypothesis, where we all need to have that certain level of arousal in order to function at our best. Stress can be a source of arousal and can help to provide stimulation so we can be at our best, as long as we're not over aroused. Also, stress can inoculate us against future stress. So we experience stress and then we learn from that. We learn how to handle future stressors from the stress that we experience. I do want to point out, if we go back to general adaptation syndrome, if you'll remember that initial experience of stress, that initial alarm stage, if you'll look at that chart or that diagram, you'll see that our resistance initially goes up. And this is because short-term stress can even result in improved immunity. Now, over the long term, our immunity goes down. But in the short term, we can have improved immunity. And this is because of cortisol. When cortisol is released in small quantities in short-term stressors, immunity can be improved. Over the long term, though, when we have too much of this, our immunity can go down. I also want to point out, too, that small amount of stress actually can reduce damage to our DNA and RNA. And it's thought that even just a little bit of stress, so not too much, but a little bit of stress might tell our body that it needs to turn up the volume, I guess you could say, on some of its antioxidant mechanisms to be more efficient in its defense against free radicals. And free radicals would be those molecules or things that we're exposed to in our environment that are responsible for aging and tissue damage and for some diseases. So those are just a few of the benefits. There are multiple other benefits to stress. I'm going to be putting an interesting TED Talk up for you on D2L where you can learn about how thinking about stress can actually have, or thinking about stress in a positive way, reframing how we think about it can have a positive effect on how our body responds to stress. We're now going to be taking a look at how we can better handle stress. We'll look at things like social support. We'll look at something called hardiness. We'll also look at optimism, but we'll also be looking at something called unrealistic optimism. So let's get started in this last section. So what can you do to moderate the effects of stress so that stress doesn't have such a detrimental effect on your health and well-being? We all experience stress. It's very normal. So what can we do so that it's not so damaging to our psychological and physical well-being? Well, one important thing that we can do is we can have an increase, or we can at least maintain our level of social support. So if we have a social network, if we have people that we know that we can talk to, and it doesn't have to be a lot of people, it may just be a couple of people, having those people in your network, having people you can talk to can be very important. For some of you, you may not have people that you can talk to, so developing those relationships can be so important. You might find that if by joining an organization where you have similar interests to other people in that organization can be a way to make friends and make connections and to develop that social support. In the field of psychology and counseling, I think you'll find that it's often a very common question that a psychologist will ask, and that would be, who is in your social support network? Who can you talk to? And so if a person doesn't have those people, helping that patient or client to develop those relationships is going to be of very significant importance. Also, hardiness seems to be very important. When we have something that we're committed to, that we are very focused on doing, for many of you, it's probably finishing your degree, perhaps it's a career goal. When you find something challenging, so it's not something that's boring, it's not something that is mundane, you actually feel stimulated by it. So it might be reading books or articles that are related to whatever you're most interested in. That's important, and that's part of hardiness. And then having that sense of control, feeling like you have control over what's going to be happening. So for example, let's think academically, knowing when you're going to be likely to graduate, having a plan, having an academic plan, that can give you that sense of control so that you see where things are going. Even just semester by semester, having a calendar, a schedule, so you know what you need to do and when you need to do it, and setting some goals for yourself, saying, I want to get at least this grade in these courses, and challenging yourself. All of this is going to help to mitigate the effects of stress. And if we're thinking about school, we can think about how doing that can help to reduce some of the stress associated with being a college student. Optimism is a very important factor as well. It turns out that people who are optimistic, they tend to think about setbacks in a temporary fashion. They think of them as situational, whereas people who are pessimistic, they're more likely to blame themselves. They're more likely to also think of setbacks as permanent, that it's something that when they experience that setback that is never ending, they're not going to be able to get out of. Things aren't going to change. And people who are optimistic tend to stay healthier in times of stress. We'll be looking at in the next module, what can we do to develop these types of abilities and skills in ourselves? And if you're going into a helping profession, how can you help others to develop this? But let's imagine that you're overly optimistic. How do you think that could be a problem? Why might that be a problem for someone? So what have you learned so far? Well, I've outlined these as a series of questions. I've outlined what you've learned this way. And so you should be able to answer these questions. What are the emotional responses to stress? And how does arousal relate to performance and our stress response? You learned about that inverted U hypothesis and how when task complexity is very simple, when tasks aren't very complex, we can take on more arousal. And we actually need more in order to function at our best. But if task complexity is very high, then we don't do so well when there's a lot of arousal. And remember that arousal can come from inside of us or outside of us. And stress is a form of arousal. You also learned about general adaptation syndrome, so you should be able to describe that. You should know the stages of each of the stages of general adaptation syndrome, the alarm stage and the resistance stage and the exhaustion stage and the characteristics of each. You should know and be able to answer the question, what are the two major brain pathways in which the brain sends the endocrine system and sends to the endocrine system our response to stress. So you should be able to answer that. We talked about, or I shared with you those two major pathways. And as I did, I talked about the role of the hypothalamus, and you learned about the role of the adrenal glands and the role of the pituitary gland. And you learned about different stress hormones. You learned about cortisol and what happens if that hormone's too high. And as you learned about these different pathways, you were able then to think about how having chronic stress and chronically high levels of stress hormones could have a negative effect on one's health. You also learned about PTSD. Many of you probably already knew about the symptoms of PTSD. And I described for you the symptoms, some of the causes and common treatment approaches, and how we might want to think of PTSD in a couple of different ways. We might think of acute trauma and then chronic trauma, although the DSM-5 looks at PTSD as just one general disorder. I mentioned that the International Classification of Disorders, the 11th edition, that they see PTSD and CPTSD, that chronic PTSD, as two different things. I won't be asking you about those two things, but I think just as people in psychology, students tend to be very curious, they like to learn a lot. So I just want to sometimes give you more background than what you might need, and that will help you as you're learning in this class and in other classes. You should also be able to answer the question, how does stress affect our physical health? And then I described for you what the beneficial effects of stress are. So what are you going to be learning next? I have a very brief video next in this chapter where you are going to learn about applying behavior modification techniques to change your own behavior and specifically to increase self-control. We know that when people are stressed that they have a decrease in self-control. So when it's not uncommon for all of us to experience stress and for one of the consequences to be a decrease in self-control. Whether it be we're not studying enough, maybe you are smoking, maybe, and you want to reduce that, maybe you find that you drink too much sometimes, or maybe you're not controlling your eating behavior, whatever those behaviors are that you'd like to decrease or increase, us like studying increase, drinking decrease, those are often connected to, are connected to stress, and sometimes it's hard to change behaviors when we're under stress and we have that reduced self-control. So you'll be learning about that in that brief video. That is the final video for this chapter. I look forward to seeing you all online. And again, please let me know what questions you have. Thank you.